Welcome, everyone, to A Way in the Art and Science of Climate Change. I'm Cheryl White, Coordinator of Visitor Engagement and Exhibitions here at the Arnold Arboretum. In my role as exhibition coordinator, I meet artists, hear proposals, and see some wonderful original art and curate shows. As coordinator of visitor engagement, I work with Arboretum visitors and our volunteers who bring the Arboretum to those visitors. A couple years ago, artist Ginny Zanger sent me a query for an art show at the Arboretum. Impressed by her proposal and the art on her website, I met with her. I found her skill and artistic sensibility strong. I was thrilled with a series of images of ice on ponds that she had done on watercolor. They had and have a quality of observing nature in a moment of time, a moment that will change immediately as the sun comes out or goes behind a cloud, as a leaf under the water moves in the melt. I invited her to show in 2021. She asked about focusing on climate change and how it might be depicted through art. I was intrigued and connected her to Cat Chamberlain. Cat is a PhD candidate and has been a research fellow here at the Arboretum. She studies phenology and how it is affected by climate change. She was also very instrumental in the Arboretum's former program of Tree Spotters, a volunteer citizen science collaboration to gather data on phenology. Fast forward to today. I had already reached out to Kat about giving our volunteers a presentation on her research. Once Ginny's show was on our website, she and I talked more about the idea of climate change and her involvement with it over time. Ginny and I began to think about a collaboration with Kat, and A Way in the Art and Science of Climate Change came about. Using art to inform science is not new. Think of centuries of botanic art and illustration. Perhaps we now deal in photomicroscopy and computer generated graphs, but the essence of science can be found in an artist's interpretation. Like a poetic metaphor, it takes us where clear but hard facts might be sometimes difficult to follow or even scary. Art is one way in. I invite you to experience the science and the art of climate change with Ginny and Kat. In the Arnold Arboretum's visual exhibition, Over Time Through Art, the Impact of Change in the Arboretum's Landscape, there are 26 images by Ginny. Some of those are in today's presentation, but others are new. All art in this presentation is by Ginny Zanger, except two photographs by Cat Chamberlain. After the talks by Ginny and Kat, we'll have a short period for questions. Please use the Q&A for any questions you would like to ask. Ginny Zanger has been a bilingual teacher in the Boston Public Schools and a vice president at Boston Children's Museum. As a visual artist, she exhibits in galleries and exhibitions throughout New England and in collections around the world. Ginny has been awarded art residencies as far away as China and in Ireland. Her undergraduate degree is from Harvard University and her doctorate from Boston University. Cat Chamberlain is a PhD candidate at Harvard University, studying the effects of climate change on temperate forests and plant communities. She's an ecologist and scientist interested in advancing community knowledge and efforts centered on environmental research, habitat restoration, and climate justice. Kat received her BS in zoology at Michigan State University and her MS in biodiversity and conservation at Trinity College in Dublin. I'd like to introduce Ginny Zanger.
So first, I want to thank Cheryl for this opportunity to share my work, my process, and to tell you the story behind the show Over Time Through Art, the Impact of Change on the Arboretum Landscape, which was originally planned to be hung in the beautiful Honeywell Gallery at the Arboretum and now is available online only. As Cheryl mentioned, when we began the discussion for this show, when I first shared my work with her, what I had in mind was a visual and personal ode to the Arboretum in all its seasons. Every April, I just can't resist the pull to set up my easel to paint these heart-stopping weeping cherries near the Forest Hills entrance, just a couple of weeks away. As a longtime resident of Jamaica Plain, I've been so fortunate to live within walking distance of the Arboretum. And this is where I've taught my children to ride bicycles, cross-country skied, rambled alone to absorb the change of seasons, and ambled with friends and family for over 50 years. These past 5 years, I've met up every weekend with a group to practice Qigong and Tai Chi among the conifers, absorbing the energies of these beautiful evergreens. When I first met with Cheryl and showed her paintings that reflected my personal artistic appreciation of the Arboretum, she agreed to exhibit that work, and I was thrilled. But as I was leaving our meeting, something moved me to suggest a different focus for the show, the impact of climate change at the Arboretum, which was something I knew nothing about, but I was eager to learn. So I asked Cheryl if I might meet with some of the climate researchers at the Arboretum, and we agreed to take a look together at the art that might come out of those meetings before deciding whether to exhibit it. So I have been a political activist since my undergraduate days at Harvard. In fact, along with other classmates, I was thrown out the night before graduation for participation in the anti-war movement and our efforts to establish Black studies and halt Harvard's expansion in Mission Hill. In recent years, alarmed by what I've learned about climate change, I have faithfully marched with Mothers Out Front, sat in with Bill McKibben at Harvard, rallied with 350.org, helped create an art installation at the last big climate change march in Washington, and most recently worked on the Harvard Forward campaign. So I was excited about the idea of meeting with a climate scientist who was studying the impact of global warming on our plants here in my neighborhood. Cheryl put me in touch with Harvard researcher and climate scientist Cat Chamberlain, who you will meet shortly. And we got together at her lab at the Arboretum. She explained phenology to me and showed me her experiments in progress. What I saw and the poetic way that she described what was happening to our plants was so moving that I knew that I'd need to try to respond somehow with a visual artistic response. Well, easier said than done. I had had some experience in bringing my environmental concerns into my art. I had spent a few years on a series about the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And it had been way more challenging than I had anticipated. What I learned from that experience is that for me, making art about the natural world is my refuge, my retreat from the struggles of life. And it's about creating beauty. Expressing or representing conflict and spoilage is not what my art life is about. But I was determined to see what might unfold as I responded to what I learned from Cat. So inspired by, perhaps by her experimental model, I decided to experiment. First, I tried a new medium, charcoal, and a new scale. For me, large is like 40 or 50 inches. And working from a photo that Kat sent me, I created this very large drawing, which I titled False Spring, Fatal Budburst, in response to what I learned from Kat about how the buds that form prematurely in response to too early warming actually get burned by the ensuing frost. I was also moved by what Kat had told me and shown me about how trees weakened by global warming can respond by lateral branching instead of vertical growth. To work with this concept visually, I enrolled in an intensive monoprint workshop with Joel Janowitz at the Mix-It studio in Somerville, because the colors of the etching inks used in printmaking are just so vibrant and expressive. So what I produced was perhaps powerful, but not beautiful to my mind. I'm not a conceptual artist, and I felt that what I made about lateral branching got the point across, but it was too literal, more like heavy-handed propaganda, not art. Cat sees it differently, and she'll show you some of those monotypes a little later. During that workshop with Joel, I made other prints that I was happier about, and yet I was disappointed that they seemed to have little to do with climate change. Over time, however, I have come to see the ways in which they do convey the emotion of environmental change. I continued making monotypes at the Menino Art Center in Hyde Park and continued experimenting. I started with an old plate, which I had embedded with leaves and other organic forms using carborundum grits that are soaked in acrylic matte medium and dried. And wouldn't you know it, the first time through the press, the plate broke in half. So curious to where that mutation to my plan might lead, I just went with it, printing from the shattered plates. And in the work that emerged, I saw how the cracked plates actually did echo our fragmented relationship to nature. And I began to feel that the fragility of our ecosystem could be conveyed through these images and would not be hitting people over the head with a message. In the middle of preparing for the show at the Arboretum, I was fortunate to experience a 3-floor exhibition about trees from the perspectives of artists, botanists, philosophers, and indigenous people from around the world in an incredible show at the Cartier Foundation in Paris. It was called We the Trees, Nous les Arbres, and the focus was to invite the public to consider trees as the essential actors in our world and to restore the position that anthropocentrism and zoocentrism have taken from them. The show made a big impression on me, especially the cross-pollination, if you will, among disciplines. I was blown away by some of the enormous woodcuts. And so when I returned to Boston, invigorated by what I had seen in Paris, I decided to make a series of large monoprints. When I got back to the print studio at the Menino Center, I continued my experiments with different materials. I actually tried placing grape stems on top of my inked plates and running them through the press, which I thought might suggest lateral branching, but more subtly and artfully than my first tries. And then COVID happened, and the print studio at the Menino Art Center closed, and without access to a press, I couldn't complete this promising printmaking work that I had hoped to be the center of the show. So I returned to my studio to prepare another body of work. And to save my sanity at the beginning of the pandemic, I began painting in the Arboretum almost every day. This Douglas fir just knocks my socks off every time I pass it on Walter Street. Do you recognize it? I will be forever grateful for the Arboretum's commitment to staying open and providing a refuge to the community through the pandemic. Thank you, Ned Friedman, and all the staff and volunteers. I can't imagine how I would have gotten through this without the comfort provided by the ancient trees, reminding us that this too would pass. Back in my studio, I continued to experiment. For years, I've been painting watercolors on a polypropylene paper called Yupo. More recently, I've been developing a technique using these materials to make monotypes without a press by making offsets from one piece of Yupo paper to another, kind of like a Rorschach. As I peel apart the 2 sheets of silky paper, the surface tension made by the wet watercolors produces unusual organic effects. And though I thought I'd invented it, I learned that this is a process that goes back centuries, and it has a name, Decalcomania. Surrealists in Paris 100 years ago worked with Decalcomanie in the 20s as a means to access the subconscious. And there's a monotype from that era in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that has some of the similar textures as my work. After I pull apart the 2 pieces of Yupo paper, I often go back and paint in with more watercolor, often using brushes that I bought in China. If you look closely at each side of this diptych, can you see the parts that are a mirror image? Almost all of the work in the Overtime exhibition, which I invite you to see online, were made with this hybrid process, which I call monotype painting. Sometimes I show the 2 pieces together, as in this piece, pastiche, but often not. What I love about this technique, what makes it so fun for me, is its experimental, serendipitous, mysterious, spontaneous nature. I never know what I'm going to get. When this piece emerged, it just stunned me. I did nothing more to it after peeling off the other piece of Yupo. And to me, it was so evocative of the evanescence of our ecosystem that the title immediately came to me, Trees of Ancient Memory, a reference to trees' uncertain future by the threat of impending climate chaos. In January, I pulled together what I felt was my strongest work for the show, and it was a challenge to select only 26 images from the 144 that I had made. I regretted that my original printmaking experiments with the press had not had a chance to coalesce due to the pandemic. So 23 of the pieces in the show are the monotype paintings using Decalcomania that I just told you about. And I also decided to include 3 other monotypes I made without a press, which I made on rice paper when I had the art residency in China a few years ago, because their delicacy complement the monotype paintings on Yupo paper. So I presented these, my best 26 images, to Cheryl, but frankly, I wasn't sure how much they spoke directly to the issues of climate change. Thankfully, Cheryl saw it right away, finding new connections that I had never thought about. And it reminded me of the old saw, artists are the last to know what their work is about. And as the show has reached people around the globe, I have been surprised and pleased to learn how people respond to the beauty and fragility of our ecosystem that is evoked in my art. I now see my work more clearly as an appreciation of the ephemeral nature of the nature that surrounds us and blesses us, not just with its beauty, but with its energies and its nourishment for our bodies, our spirit, and all other life forms who share this earth. To marshal an appropriate response to the threat of the global warming that scientists are warning us about, and to paraphrase Robin Wall Kimmerer, science alone may be too narrow a discipline for the task. As an artist, I am honored to join in the effort with scientists as creative as Cat Chamberlain. And I want to thank the Arboretum for this opportunity to bring together my worlds, the personal, the creative, and the political. And now I'd like to turn it over to the soon-to-be Dr. Cat Chamberlain.
Ginny, thank you. That was so powerful and moving, and I've never felt so mindful and present going into a talk. You brought a lot of peace and thoughtfulness, and also invoked a lot of emotion. And before I really dive in, I want to take a moment to just appreciate again what Ginny has told us and what Ginny has shown us, and take a moment to reflect on how we feel about what she has shown and told us about. Let us reflect on the language that she used. She used words like ode and weeping cherries. She used the term ephemeral natures and evanescence. Ginny talks of energies, but not in a metabolic way or an organism requirement sense, but rather in this emotional state. And as a listener, you are delivered this poetic story while also being visually stimulated. I'm a scientist. I use words like metabolic. I use words like phenology and organism. You'll hear me talk today about false spring, as you heard Ginny mention, and I will also discuss what bud burst is. Ginny and I met about 2 years ago, and throughout my time at the Arboretum, John Hetman and Cheryl have introduced me to various folks throughout the public, some undergraduates and graduate students. I've also met with folks from the media, but my interaction with Ginny was so powerful and moving. So 2 years ago during my PhD, I was in the middle of an experiment, and it's exhausting. It's exciting and thrilling, but when you're in the middle of an experiment, it's like I said, exhausting. So Ginny and I sat down in the Weld Hill Research Center, and we had this discussion, and she had such curiosity and excitement, but as I'm sure you could sense from her talk, she was also so calm. And I was instantly struck by how she managed to juggle that balance. As a scientist, we're taught to have this curiosity, to demonstrate and push forward with our science with that same curiosity. And Ginny and I ended up chatting for over an hour. We looked through, I showed her my plants up in the greenhouses, and we did a little tour. We connected about our backgrounds and time in Ireland. And I left just feeling invigorated and refreshed. She told me, she kept urging me to write poetry because she loved these terms of false spring and bud burst and leaf out. So again, I'm a scientist, but I'm a scientist on the path of humility. I hope that many of you had the chance to tune in to Ned's series on the pecan, the intersection of biodiversity and human diversity. If not, I please encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and check out the series. I had a chance to listen to Robin Wall-Kimmerer's talk and Taya Miles' talk. And between that series and reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall-Kimmerer and listening to a recent interview between John Kerry and Al Gore, there was almost this urgency, this intensity from my climate leaders to forge this path forward of humility. As conservationists, as climate scientists, we need to make change. And in order to make change, you must act. But maybe we should demonstrate our willingness to make change and our tolerance by admitting our own lack of knowledge, accept our limitations, and express our desire to learn and grow. And that's the only real way to make positive change. So today, I want to take a little moment to provide you all space. I can't see you, I can't hear you, but I want to ask one question. What is climate change? And you should all take a moment you can say it out loud. Again, I can't hear you, and just reflect on what you think climate change is. If you don't know, that's great. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you learned something. And I really appreciate your honesty. I'm sure a lot of you, when you first think about climate change, you think of it very scientifically. Rising CO2 levels, rising sea levels, increasing temperatures, increase in natural disasters. So, and that's all correct. That's exactly what we hear from the media. That's exactly what climate change is causing. But I want to also take a moment, maybe rather than asking what is climate change, but how do we feel about climate change? So again, I ask you to take a moment and think about the connection that climate change makes in your body, how it feels in your body. A lot of people, when they ask me about climate change, they start the conversation by expressing this concern for their children or their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews, this fear for the next generations to come. A lot of folks will ask, is it as dire as it sounds? Almost begging me to tell them it's not that bad, don't worry so much. There's so much fear around this climate change. As a scientist, I'm a climate scientist. I spend every day crunching data, thinking about the effects of climate change on our New England trees, on our Arboretum trees. And there can be moments where it's just devastating. And so as a community, we often discuss this as juggling the two major emotions of hope versus despair. We need despair to encourage us to recognize how urgent this issue is, but we also need hope to keep moving forward. We need hope to inspire us to that we are actually doing something worthwhile. So that's what I think is so beautiful about using art as a communication form, because it invokes this energy and these emotions. And I hope that throughout this talk, you can really reflect on what you see from Ginny and what you hear from me to recognize how that balance of hope and despair feels within you. So this first slide is a series of images. All of the images here are from Ginny. And I think this initial slide really demonstrates the beauty of what I study, phenology. So I think about when leaves first come out in the spring and throughout that growing season until they drop in the fall. And in this first image, in this upper right or left panel, excuse me, I kind of envision that springtime. It's nice and green. There are these beautiful leaves that are unfurling. And over time, we have this full growing season. And eventually at the end of the growing season, our leaves start to fall and to drop. The other thing that really catches my eye is this upper right panel, this image. There's this vibrant red and orange and yellow, and it's striking, it's moving, it's beautiful. But I also think of climate change. These are these increasing temperatures. This is this warming that is affecting our trees at the Arboretum or in New England or in Michigan or Chicago. I have a lot of family tuning in from the Midwest. This warming can be really tough on a tree, especially in the summertime. So if the leaves are coming out early in the spring, by the summer of June, July, August, if we have a drought or really hot spells, hot, dry spells, this can be very damaging to a tree. And even in the middle of the summer, some of the branches, some of the lower branches might turn reds and browns, and the tree will actually drop those leaves early. And that's a way for the tree to survive. That's a way for the tree to recognize what energy it needs to invest in and where. So that I encourage you all, there's a possibility of a drought this summer. I encourage you all to walk around the Arboretum and take notice of these branches that are maybe lower on in the canopy, and the rest of the canopy is nice and green and lush and beautiful. These lower branches might turn color early and drop, and that can be a sign of the tree just adapting to the season and the increase in temperatures. So as Ginny mentioned, she came to me curious about how to portray climate change and how to see climate change now in the current moment. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And that's a really tough thing to depict. And she acknowledged that too in her talk of how difficult this was to approach such a challenge. And this series, again, to me, just beautifully shows what we're seeing in real time, the effects of climate change on our trees. So I study phenology. And this is a term that is used a lot in describing when bears hibernate or when birds migrate. It's this recurring event that happens every year. It's a part of the life history of these species. And the way that I think about phenology in my research is in terms of plants. So in the springtime, we have trees, and right now, I'm sure you can all see it. These trees will start to show buds, and we'll have bud bursts. And bud burst is when the buds start to unfurl just a bit and the first initial green tips are exposed. And that's when the leaves are starting to come out. And eventually those bud scales will continue to peel back, and those green tips will grow and grow and grow until you see a full leaf unfurl. And so that timing, that bud burst, is really critical to think about as a scientist and as a community. It's a sign of spring. It's full of hope. It's inspiring. And when that leaf fully unfolds, that leaf is a harvesting machine. It takes in that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It converts it into sugars and to starches. It stores it in its body and in the roots and in the soil. and it spews out this energizing, refreshing, pure oxygen for us to breathe. Trees are climate change conquerors. They're our warriors. And we need to have a sense of when exactly they are doing the most work. And we need to make sure they continue to be robust in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. So right now in the Northern Hemisphere, around the 1980s, we started seeing this upward trend in temperatures. We saw this warming. So climate change, human-induced climate change, anthropogenic climate change is what it's called, started before that, but we didn't actually start seeing this increase in temperatures until around the 1980s. Plants are cued to initiate that process of bud burst to leaf out by 3 different cues. The first cue is that sunlight. And so in this image, what I see is this big, powerful sun in this tiny tree. And I imagine that that tree doesn't have any leaves yet. And the sun, though it is year-round, as we know, the days get longer. We see more and more sunlight. And as those days get longer, trees are responding to that. They're sensing that. And trees are also very much responding to temperatures. As temperatures warm in the spring, the tree accumulates that warming and knows when it's finally safe to unfurl those leaves. So a tree wants to bud burst and leaf out as early as possible for a few reasons. First, it wants to outcompete its friends in the community. It wants to take advantage of that open canopy and take in as much sunlight and as much CO2 as it can to store as much carbon and sugars and starch and make as much food as it can throughout the season so that it can reproduce, so that it can grow big and strong and make it easier to outcompete in the future years. So since these trees are responding to these increasing temperatures, and we're seeing this trend since the 1980s of this increase in temperatures, as you can imagine, our trees are starting to leaf out earlier and earlier in the season. And that's great because it's going to grow for longer and we're going to have this really beautiful season full of green, and it's going to be a real thick forest. And then towards the end of the season, it's going to stay warmer for longer and our leaves will eventually drop later on in the season. This image to me is just so beautifully depicts phenology. And I hope you see that now, but I also hope that you all create your own connection with these images as well, these pieces. So as I mentioned, bud burst is occurring earlier in the season. But when we think about March in Boston or in Michigan, temperatures fluctuate a lot, right? If I think about climate in March, it could be anywhere from 70 degrees and beautiful and sunny. And then the next weekend we have this massive blizzard, right? It's really unpredictable. There's a lot of variability. And even though climate change is causing this trend, this upward trend in increasing temperatures, it's not removing that variability. We can still have polar vortexes. We can still have blizzards in March. We can still have freezes in April. And this is a big concern with climate change. If our leaves are coming out sooner, that risk of a freeze is a little higher because freezes are not advancing at the same rate as leaf out is advancing. So this phenomena is called a false spring. A false spring is when these leaves come out a little too early and then we get hit by freezing temperatures. And those temperatures don't have to be too cold. It can be around 25 degrees Fahrenheit and it can last for, a few hours overnight. And that can be enough to be damaging, especially to our seedlings and our saplings, our little guys, our little fighters. This image to me is what I see as this just gorgeous wintry scene. And there's this faint green throughout this wintry scene. And I think it's the perfect piece to demonstrate exactly what I imagine fall spring to look like. A really, really harsh kind of depiction of a fall spring. What I envision is that this branch, maybe a week ago, was vibrant and green. The temperatures were warm, it was beautiful out, and these leaves started to come out and show themselves. And then we got hit by one of those classic Boston blizzards in March. and all of these leaves died. And that can happen a lot to our magnolia flowers or to our leaves. And if the freeze is big enough or harsh enough, it can actually decimate a forest. It can completely wipe out a forest. And there was a big major event in 2007 and also in 2012. But it also can, even if it just is hitting the seedlings and saplings, as you can imagine, that can have impacts on the next generations of our trees. So what exactly is happening? I love this image so much. This is like the best teaching tool I've ever seen. I'm very grateful for Ginny for this one. But what I see here is this, it's like I'm looking through a microscope and I'm getting this beautiful slide of leaves, and we see our stems and our leaves, and we can see the cells within the leaf. And so what's happening to a leaf when it's damaged by a freeze? So what I see is we have cells here that are very small, and then we have these larger cells. And a leaf, to stay strong and tough and to be that harvesting machine, needs to have water in it. And water provides a tree with stability. Water keeps a tree upright. Water also keeps the leaves tight and have turgor is what we call. And this turgor is necessary, again, for that harvesting machine to work. If we're in the middle of a drought or you forget to water your houseplant, you'll notice that the leaves will start wilting. And that's because there's less water in the leaves to keep it upright. So in these smaller cells, what I see is water. In these larger cells, I see ice. So let's think about an ice tray. You have your ice tray, you fill it with water, and you try and get it as full as possible because you want a full ice cube, but you also don't want to go too far because then it's just so exciting trying to open the freezer door and put it in the freezer and there's water everywhere. So the water is just below that lip, right? So we have water just below the lip, put it in the freezer, and when we open up the freezer door the next day, the ice cube is larger than the lip. Right? It goes over the lip. I encourage you all to do this little experiment at home today and tomorrow. And the reason for that is because solids take up more space than liquids. So this is ice in these cells. And when that ice thaws, when that ice melts, that liquid is not going to occupy the entire space. It's going to be like a deflated balloon. And that's going to allow for air to seed in, and there's going to be little air pockets, air bubbles within these cells. And those bubbles tend to burst. And if we have a bursting bubble in our cell, that's going to cause the damage. That's going to rupture the cell and make this bit look brown and dead. And that could eventually kill the entire leaf. As we see in this image, there's lots of large cells, lots of freezing that occurred on this leaf. So I wanted to look at false springs on seedlings and saplings. So I did this experiment at the Arboretum, as I mentioned and Ginny mentioned. And here's an image from my experiment. This is a willow. It was really small, but willows are weedy. They can grow really, really fast. And I exposed this individual when it was really, really little to a false spring. And as you could see, this terminal branch was completely whacked by this false spring. It really suffered, it died. But it was able to grow and thrive around this terminal branch. It was able to really adapt and do really, really well. And we see that in Ginny's image. And this gives me a lot of joy. And I've used this actually in presentations before, just to see this comparison. And what I see, the difference between my image and Ginny's is that Ginny's inspires this hope again, right? This individual, though it was hit, still thrived. It survived, and it's doing better than ever. And there's just these whites, and it's very bright and vibrant and lush. But not all species can handle false springs the same way. So here I have a birch. This is a yellow birch. This is my poster child for this experiment because this individual is wild. But we can see that these leaves in particular definitely got burned by that false spring. They're dying, they're less green, they're not harvesting as much energy as they can versus these other very green, nice leaves. But then we also see this wild growth pattern. This individual is haphazard. It is desperately trying to find a way to survive, but it is not doing it effectively. It is not growing efficiently or very well at all. And Ginny created this image that is again, it's sloping. We have this downward growth into the ground. It feels like it's dying. There's these patches of light that represent these hopeful leaves, but the rest of it is so dark and gloomy. And this individual would very likely not survive in a forest because it would be outcompeted by the individuals that are doing better, like that willow. So there's so much emotion and so much power from this image. This is almost comical seeing this. This is educational, but this is powerful and moving and creates this connection to our trees and to our earth and to think about climate change in a new way. Here again, we see this lateral branching, and we saw Ginny showed a similar picture to this. But I kind of like to see that. I think of this image almost as forecasting what could happen to our forests in the future. And up at the top, I almost see this foreshadowing of what could have been. These trees should have been tall and lush and powerful, but instead we're seeing this funny lateral branching. The forest is shorter, it's not as thick. And this individual in particular, it's almost like Ginny highlighted where the growth should have been, but instead we're seeing this lateral outshoot. And the reason why this growth pattern is inefficient and not very good for an individual is because this tree is trying to suck up water, suck up nutrients from the soil and from the earth and pump it through the main trunk. And if you're going upright and that water is just on a channel and streaming upwards, that's going to be coming through very forcefully and powerfully and efficiently. But if there's this big bend, you have to slow down, just like you're turning off of a highway. And it's not going to be able to pump through as quickly or as well. And that's going to make it harder for this branch to continue on. Another thing that can happen is that a tree wants to grow nice and big and tall. It's trying to, again, take in that sunlight from above and outcompete the other individuals. So if it's growing laterally, it's not going to be taller than the other individuals likely, and it's not going to be able to take in that sunlight as easily. So there's a lot of consequence to not growing straight. And this is obviously an issue and something that I think a lot about when I think about climate change and false springs. These images are so striking to me. And I want to take a second. The first time I saw these, I had a mixture of excitement because I saw such a beautiful teaching tool, but I also felt this intense pit in my stomach. They almost make me want to cry. They make me very emotional. I find these so deeply moving, so powerful. They're almost metaphoric. The first word that I thought of when I saw these images was smokestacks. Our projections forecast this dire future, one that is daunting and unsustainable. But these forecasts, what we hear from the media or the IPCC reports, are based on our current habits. If we learn to live with species, to live with our environment, and establish a symbiosis with the species around us, with the land around us, these projections can change. These smokestacks in these images are causing such harm and destruction. There's just this smoky, doomy, gloomy layer, and these trees are desperately trying to outshoot these lateral branches, but these lateral branches are thin and less productive and less powerful, and we are just destroying our warriors, our conquerors of climate change. But if we can make change now, our future can look a lot more hopeful. And when I say change, I mean creating your own relationship with climate change, establishing where you fit into that story. Ginny has done this beautiful job of creating this artwork and telling the story through this new lens. I study it by asking very specific questions and doing experiments. But you all have your own relationship with the world and the earth, and you all have your own way of communicating and invoking that emotion in others. The other way that we can is small things. The other thing we can do is, compost or have a little garden, recycle a little more cleanly and thoughtfully, use biodegradable soaps and cleaning materials. And if we do that, and if we work as a community and all work towards the same goal, our future can look a little bit brighter. This image to me, again, represents this future. This is the final piece that I'll show today, but I see this future spring. I see this funky lateral growth. I see small ice particles in the air. Trees are diminishing in abundance, but these individuals almost look like they are dancing. They are celebrating the space, and there's more hope in the air. As Robin Wall Kimmerer taught us, as a scientist, we need to learn from the trees. Ginny has provided this way for scientists and the community to connect with trees in new ways and to listen to them in a new way. This is the first time that I've given a talk like this before. My goal was to educate while also tuning into this humility that has been urged by my climate leaders. I wanted to honor the trees and approach science with curiosity and emotion. So I again want to create some space and ask you all, what does climate change mean to you? Well, what we've learned today is that climate change means a lot of things. I hope that my story and Ginny's perspective and artistic lens have given you a new relationship and that you can approach this scientific issue with a little more emotion, whether this is hope or despair or a balance of both.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Ginny. I want to sincerely thank you both for your articulate, insightful, and passionate presentations. And now I'd like to open it up for questions. So if you have some questions, I will ask our panelists to unmute themselves. Pamela Thompson is also here as a panelist and has been very helpful for this webinar. And she is our manager of adult education, and we'll be looking at your questions. For Kat, could you say again what causes lateral branching?
Yeah, sure. So for the seedlings and saplings that I was experimenting with, they often are very small, 6 to 12 inches long, and I was putting them in what's called a growth chamber, and I was exposing them to really cold temperatures overnight. And that resulted in the death of that terminal bud, the top leaf that was coming up. And oftentimes the individual would respond by growing, branching on the sides. It couldn't no longer grow upwards. It was responding by growing these lateral branches.
Yes, there's a very long lead up to this, but to sum up the question, someone was comparing our current situation with COVID and trying to come up with this vaccine. What do you see as the most effective slowing mechanisms that we can focus on that will help us reach something like vaccines? What do you see would be a vaccine for climate change?
I'll take a stab at this, and then Ginny, I'd be curious about your answer too, but no pressure. Climate change, like the vaccine, it required many minds. Right? We had this epic battle, but it was this communal effort, right? Everyone wanted to work together to make a vaccine. And now we have many different types of vaccines, and we need all of them to work together. The way that I see climate change is, yes, we can change our small habits, but we also need creativity. I think communicating and getting the word out and trying to inspire all these curious minds to come up with a unique and innovative solution is our best path forward. So there's a lot of wild ideas out there, like sending satellites into the atmosphere that have mirrors and deflect the sunlight back towards space. And it takes that sort of energy and that excitement to make a massive change.
Ginny?
Whoa, didn't think I'd have to be answering this one today. But I think it's an interesting point that COVID has really taught us that first of all, the lesson that none of us are safe until we're all safe, that we're all in this boat together. And we've seen that when there's this political will that we need to solve this, we seem to be able to solve this. And for me, it's really about getting everyone on board. And I've been very inspired by 350.org has inspired me to see how people around the world in so many different ways, in so many communities, and especially in Indigenous communities, are taking actions to both mitigate climate change and also raise consciousness. So I think we just, there's this talk about we have to be on a war footing for COVID. I think I think climate change demands equal commitment, if not more.
Great, thank you. And Ginny, here's one for you as well, from Ellen Messer. She wanted you to reflect a little on the color selection and usage process that you had, particularly since she's noticing the use of whites and blacks and reds in most of your artworks.
I never took a color theory class. I don't plan my colors. I do like to work often in black and white because especially mono printing, it just is more dramatic. It works better. I tend to use a palette that reflects an organic palette that reflects the nature, which is pretty much my subject matter. And one thing is, as I've said, most of the pieces are watercolor, and what's beautiful about watercolor is it does come from organic materials, and they all flow together in a way that nature does as well.
Can sharp ice crystals and cells actually pierce the cell wall and tear it? And then also, can you talk about how some plants can tolerate freezes and how they do that? Some of these early bulbs we see coming up right now, especially, and how they handle those freezes.
Sure. For the sharp icicles, I am not sure. I'm trying to think of there is a way, sometimes we see these big ice storms in the spring, and that just creates this heaviness for a branch, and the branch will eventually snap. So I wonder if that's kind of something similar of what the questioner is asking.
I'm sorry, ice crystals, not icicles.
Ice crystals, yes, yeah.
So
within the plant, it's
yeah.
more the thaw action that's causing, and this air seeding that's coming in. But yes, sometimes it can completely rupture because it's so large that it's occupying this space and it ruptures the cell. There's a lot of different mechanisms, and I'll try and keep this not get too excited about my answer here, because it's very, very cool what trees can do. Over the winter, I mentioned that trees have this water within them, and that water, it's not just pure water. There's a lot of other solutes. And so if we think about salt water, it freezes at a much lower temperature than pure water. And again, this could be another experiment you do at home, but it takes longer to freeze. And so a lot of trees will pump in solutes into these water channels over the winter so that it's harder to freeze over the winter. Another thing that some trees do in the springtime is they have little hairs, and you might notice this if you start watching the bud burst action. Some of these buds are covered in hairs, and it's almost like this warming blanket, and it adds this sort of boundary layer so that the hairs will freeze before the actual leaf freezes.
Great. This might be just a real quick answer or not, but this is for Ginny. Melinda Martinez wants to know if you'll be going back to your original ideas with the print press once COVID is more under control.
Yep, I'm there.
Great, great.
Can climate change as embodied in trees or plant life be observed by close inspection of art from earlier times? For example, Monet's water lilies. And I'll just chime in here that we have been partnering with the Harvard Art Museums on their Painting Edo exhibit, and those plants are exhibiting, perhaps idealized, but they're exhibiting plant life and animal life at that time period. And that can definitely be compared to flowering, etc., in our current time period. So I'll just kick off with that and toss it out to you.
I think this is one for the scientist.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Yes, that's a really cool idea, and I haven't thought of that before. So I love this question. But a lot of times scientists use herbarium, and herbarium are just presses. They're plants that scientists and botanists have collected for hundreds of years, and they put it in paper and they put it in this beautiful museum. And now today we can look back and see, as Pam alluded to, when flowers came out, when leaves came out, and we can see how this trend of budburst timing and leaf out timing has changed. So that's a really interesting thought of looking at a community and looking at an artist's perspective from long time ago and seeing how much our gardens and our environment has changed.
Great. This might be a little bit leading or uncomfortable, particularly for you, Kat, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So it's just really talking about having different positions in this space, and scientists have often been very self-critical about their role and the lack of effective communication. Do you think scientists are bad communicators? And I have to say, that's why we're doing this. I think this really shows you what we can do with science. We can have art, we can have other things that relate to it. So I'm just popping in with that because this has been such a fabulous and eye-opening collaboration that I think goes a long way to bringing beautiful art about something that can be really, as I said before, scary. So if you bring those together, maybe we can reach more people. But I'm going to go back to the original question and ask Kat if you think scientists are maybe usually bad communicators.
Thank you for that buffer, Cheryl. I think that's a great question. And honestly, scientists have to wear so many hats. That's something I didn't appreciate until I started this PhD is, as a scientist, you have to be curious. You have to ask questions. You have to run statistics. You have to know math. You have to give conferences and lectures. And you also have to be a really, really good writer. There's different ways of communicating. Some of my colleagues are phenomenal writers, whereas others are a little more nervous when they give presentations. So I don't know if I can just have this blanket statement of scientists are usually poor communicators, but I do think, again, going back to this urgency of using the community as a whole, scientists could use some help of having extra hands and extra voices to maybe communicate the science a little more easily to the public, to inform policy, to the media, and that maybe there's different layers and elements and roles that are available.
Someone is saying, don't we have to be careful to temper man's tendency towards innovation with natural processes? We tend to be arrogant about our ideas to cure nature and don't find out until the long-term results happen.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, going back to the example I gave of sending massive mirrors into space seems like a pretty wild and not really smart idea. And I think that's a great way to echo kind of this humility that these leaders are suggesting, is that we take our time and we recognize our bounds, and we don't push for change that we don't totally know the answer to. And we do need to think about our innovation tread with caution.
Here's another one for Ginny, perhaps. She finds it easy to respond to your paintings and monoprints as works of art, as I do, and I hope we all do. Give us some tips on how to see these works in climate change terms without the aid of labels.
Well, I would say this collaboration with Cat and having her explain it to us is the clearest that I can think of. I have put a few titles that I felt, again, communicated, suggested the connections without hitting people over the head. And I think titling the show the way it was titled helps people to make their own connections. I think, one thing that I've learned from this experience is to really rely on people's own creativity and how other people's minds work to make the connections. And that what I had in mind may not be what other people see. And, it works both ways. It's a really good question, and I will think about it. When art shows are reviewed, which doesn't seem to happen very often because we don't seem to have the press that we used to, I think that gives the public an opportunity to learn more about it from a reviewer. But again, that's few and far between. So something to think about. Good question. Thank you.
And thank you, Kat. Jenny and Kat. I want to ask one last question and then we'll need to end. But I thank everybody for the really insightful and thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them, but I think this last one is particularly appropriate to end this presentation. So we'll start with Kat and then Ginny. What was the most surprising thing you both learned from this collaboration?
I learned to kind of take a step back when approaching my science and to, kind of try and emulate Ginny's perspective and calmness and taking time to think about what I'm seeing and what I'm actually learning from the trees. And to also use new methods to express my findings and communicate those new methods.
Ginny?
Oh, so many things. First, the first thing I learned was that scientists can be poets. That's what I learned from Kat the first time I met her. Another thing I learned is that I have more faith in relying on the next generation to figure this out for us. Again, kudos to Kat. And I mean that. Another thing I learned is life happens. We make plans. I had this great plan, but things to trust in the process, that things will evolve. Another thing I learned was an affirmation of the value of experimentation. I'm not an artist who wants to paint the same picture over and over. And one thing that keeps me going is trying out new materials, new approaches. And so that's something. And then I just want to say that Cheryl is the person who really made this collaboration happen. And the three of us, I just feel so blessed by this magical collaboration that we want to figure out how to take it somewhere else because it's so synergistic. I never would have predicted excuse the metaphor, the fruition of that first meeting that I had with Cheryl and then with Kat to really expand out to the broader community in the way that this has.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. It's been a great experience. So the collaboration for me, if anyone wants to know, has been fabulous. And one of the highlights really so far this year, just connecting art and science is something I try to do all the time in the exhibitions at the Arboretum. And this particular one just epitomizes everything that I have strived for, working at the Arboretum, being an artist myself and a writer. And so I'm thrilled with both Ginny's and Cat's presentations. I thank everyone here in the audience for coming and attending, taking time from your morning. We really appreciate it. And as I said before, there will be a number of websites that I think you will find interesting that we will send to everyone who registered for this event. So thank you very much.